Hello, this is Chris Guthrie here from the Office of Digital Learning, and this video will walk you through basically the ins and outs and the progressions for establishing that blended learning environment or classroom. Now keep in mind, this is a step-by-step process. It is a progression for a reason, and that it will not happen overnight. It will not happen in a week. It will not happen in a month. This can take years. And so what this video walks you through is my own personal experiences through trial and error, my own professional studies, and my personal studies. And so I'm hoping that this gives you some idea of where to start and what this might look like. Blended learning can help both the teacher and the students meet the many demands put upon them. To fully embrace the creation of blended learning classroom, a shift is required by both the teacher and the student. I like to compare planning for a blended learning classroom as if you're taking a road trip. And so when you're in the planning stages of the road trip, the planner or planners have to map everything out. Think ahead. Do I have the proper vehicle? What stops will we make? Do we need snacks? Do we need activities? Are we going to plan activities once we get to certain locations? And you also are planning for any potential emergencies or obstacles. Well, planning for a blended learning classroom is no different. However, when your road trip starts, hopefully those planners change their role and they get to just enjoy the trip. Well, planning blended learning is the same. The teacher is ultimately the one in charge of planning and the implementation. However, once the trip starts, they need to relinquish some of the control so that they and their students can enjoy the ride and grow and learn. The teacher moves to the facilitation of learning, while the structure is in place to allow that to happen. The way that learning happens changes. Teachers are now the facilitator. As the facilitator of learning, you want to define your role clearly. Be realistic. You cannot be everything to everyone. Set up what you know you can handle as well as what you know you cannot. Set up what you know your students can handle as well as what you know they cannot. Make your role transparent. Set up the expectations as to the time and place to ask questions and seek assistance from you. That's why setting up those norms and expectations is huge. Set up the time and the place that you will review and provide students with feedback. Finally, set up a time and a place where you can actively engage with your students. 3, establish those boundaries, and you know what? Hold yourself to those boundaries. Hold your students accountable to those boundaries. If you are only available to assist students when you're not working in small groups, then stick to it. If you are only going to review online work during your planning time, then stick to it. And lastly, leverage technology. Utilize the online platforms and tools to improve or replace your instructional practices. Use the tools that may provide personalized learning for your students. Use Schoology pages to build multimedia resources for your students. Use databases that the county has paid for research and materials for you and your students. A blended learning classroom requires a shift for students too. They are no longer allowed to be the passengers on the road trip, along for the ride. They need to navigate their own learning. They need to be a planner, mapping out their learning activities. They need to be self-regulators and evaluators. Provide tools for them that allow them to assess where they are with their learning. Moving themselves forward is key. Allow them time to reflect. Own their own choices. Allow for natural consequences, good or bad, to come to the students. Finally, Students need to advocate for themselves. They need to recognize what they need from themselves, their classmates, and the teacher, and how to effectively communicate their needs. Starting to see why this doesn't happen quite overnight? So back to the road trip analogy. You're not going to become a world-class traveler in one trip. You need to learn as you go. On each trip, you may learn what is best way to pack, what's the best site to book for travel, when's the best time to go, and so on. Well, building a blended classroom is kind of like that. You can't just say it will happen and then poof, it happens. It cannot successfully be established in one sitting. It's recommended that you train yourself and your students how to be successful in phases. To successfully establish a blended learning classroom, we encourage you to do so using a progression. The progression that I'm recommending comes from research and recommendations from Catlin Tucker, Redbird Advanced Learning, and Blended Learning PD from Marcia Kish. In addition, I took what I know has worked and honestly what's realistic in a classroom and added my own spin. One part that is key to remember to do in all phases and what Catlin Tucker recommends is using the business world's model for onboarding. She recommends this for digital tool use, but I recommend these three components in each of the following phases in blended learning. 1, train. When something new is introduced, like a tool, a platform, etc., take the time to train your students on how to properly use that tool. Be sure they know how to access the tool and use it effectively. In addition to that, train norms, expectations, reminders of all the things that work, that help make your classroom work well. Define. With each of the phases, define the learning space and the behaviors with your students. Share the objectives and goals, engage students in setting expectations for both offline and online work, reinforce active learning as well as digital citizenship, and model and communicate community norms as it relates to seeking assistance, owning choices, completion of work, and so on. And then lastly, support. Help students navigate by creating scaffolds, checklists, rubrics that may be needed. Communicate clearly, monitor and engage with students, promote that collaborative learning as well as student agency. As we take a look at these phases, remember that with each phase, you want to use that onboarding approach, train, define, support. First is foundation, then we move to transition, then we move to expansion. Phase 1, foundation, is setting your blended learning journey on the right path. Take the time to move through this carefully. This may take a month or more with the goal in mind that students should be able to work and produce and problem solve both independently and when working with you. You want to foster the shift for students to become those self-starters and advocates. You want to move to that facilitator, creating connections in a different setting than the whole group. Establish those routines and expectations. Create those unstuck strategies with your students and establish what is expected. Allow them to own their choices by providing them with timely feedback. As you support your students, shift and create them. I recommend in this phase, students move strictly between online and offline learning activities to start providing simple choices like this or that, or maybe introduce a time station rotation that just involves 2 stations. This phase lets you know what kind of travelers you will have, and then it helps you and them navigate into the next phases. Phase 2 allows you to transition into more of a more fluid format. You're incorporating more 21st century skills, deeper thinking, critical learning, creativity. You'll want to bring in student collaboration and add more opportunities for students to own their own learning. This might be where you want to introduce some personalized learning, whether it comes from a platform like Lexia, Dreambox, Khan, or maybe you want to start to establish a playlist, Must Do, Can Do, or Genius Hour. In this phase, you will want to introduce differentiated learning opportunities that are data-driven. These opportunities may be done in small group or individually assigned. You will want to move away from the time stations and implement that more flexible model and incorporate a structure like a pathway or a playlist, as well as checklists along the way. Students are more independent and are adapting to the learning activities to meet expectations. The teacher is spending little whole group time and is more of that facilitator. This may take several months. You may be in this phase for several months to truly establish. During this part, get student feedback as to what is working and what is not. Allow them to know that they are the navigators and you welcome their support in the journey. And honestly, you may stay in the transition phase and just adding more rotations as you go along, adding deeper, more independent work that students have to think more, and you may stay there for an entire year. Nothing wrong with that. Finally, phase 3. Lesson models are still utilized as it relates to time with direct instruction or small group. However, during this expansion phase, the classroom is transformed into a 21st century classroom. Here you're focusing on students independently navigating through their learning, the routines and structure, using the routines and structures that were created. It is fully embracing some type of personalized learning on a weekly basis. It may not be every day. It may be several days a week. In addition, you're looking for opportunities for authentic learning, and you also might be introducing project-based learning. Students have choice over time, place, path, and pace. It's fluid. And the teacher is moving to that facilitator consult role after doing any kind of direct or small group instruction. The data-driven decisions shape the learning activities, and the students regulate, evaluate, collaborate, and advocate. Choices are owned, and the teacher is supporting students through structures like checklists and rubrics that are put in place. Blended learning has many components. Both you and your students will grow and change as you progress to establish a blended learning classroom. This will not happen overnight and probably not even in a year. Progress, push yourself and your students, and you will get there.